Living on an acreage or owning a large piece of land can offer a lot of advantages, and it can also give you a really unique lifestyle. However, there are also some challenges that come along with it. So today we are going to explore both the pros and the cons of acreage living. Where I live in rural Saskatchewan, there are many people who live on an acreage or on a farm. There are also many people who live in town who often say that their dream is to live on an acreage in close proximity to town. So for all of you dreamers out there, today we are going to be discussing the advantages and disadvantages of acreage living. So let's start out with the advantages. So number one is space and privacy. So owning an acreage or a farm gives you a ton of space compared to living in town. You could own anything from, you could have a couple acres to a whole quarter section of land, which is 160 acres if you are farming. So having this much space obviously gives a lot of privacy and a sense of seclusion. So you don't have a lot of neighbors close by. You're not going to be rubbing shoulders with a lot of people compared to if you were living in town. Number two is peace and serenity. So living on an acreage is obviously a lot more quiet than living in an urban area. So you're not having to deal with all of the noises of city life, the cars driving by, all of the people. It's very quiet, it's very tranquil. You can enjoy nature. You can hear birds chirping, crickets, and maybe even if you're close to a small body of water, you can hear water in the distance. These are all things that can be enjoyed on an acreage compared to living in town. Number three is the potential for agricultural pursuits. So obviously with owning all of this land, you have the opportunity to pursue some agricultural activities such as farming, gardening, or even having some livestock. So I've been to some acreages where people have large greenhouses, large gardens, some chickens, some other animals, and some people even get to the point where they are almost self-sufficient, which is very neat to see in this day and age. Number four is recreational activities. So when you live on an acreage, you can take advantage of being out of town and doing some different recreational things like hiking, horseback riding, hunting on your own private land. That's a really big one if you have lots of bushland on your property as well. So this is one thing that is great for the outdoor enthusiasts. And the last advantage that I'm going to talk about today is customization and flexibility. So when you're out of town and you have all of this space, you can kind of do what you want with this land. So if you want to build your dream home, if you want to do some really unique landscaping, there's just, the sky is the limit with what you can do out on an acreage. And there's definitely less rules with what you can do compared to in town. So now let's discuss some of the challenges that come along with owning an acreage. So first off, probably the biggest one is going to be living a distance away from town and amenities and all of these things. So obviously it's going to be a bit challenging when you have to drive to work every day. You have to consider driving back to town to take your children to different activities or shopping centers, going to the grocery store. All of these things are not going to be just right there for you to run to a store or just a walking distance away. It's just going to be taking more time. So you have to factor in the time it takes to drive, and you also have to factor in the extra cost of paying for gas to go to and from acreage to town every day. Number two is increased maintenance. So obviously owning more land, owning larger property means more maintenance. So if you've owned a home before, you know the maintenance that comes along with it. And on an acreage, it's just multiplied. So a big one would be taking care of the landscaping on an acreage. I know people who own acreages that spend hours and hours just cutting their grass every week in the summertime. So this is something that is, needs to be considered. And another form of maintenance, on an acreage, you would have a private sewer system. So it's your responsibility to maintain these systems, making sure that everything is working properly, as well as depending what your water source is. So if you have a well, then you need to make sure that the quality and the quantity is good. And then you also need to make sure your pumps are working properly. And in winter months, there can be issues with freezing up. So those are all things that have to be maintained and kept up by the owner. So the third challenge I'm going to discuss is higher costs. So owning an acreage typically does cost more money to maintain. So we're talking about the maintenance. There's going to be extra costs there. Even utilities can be more expensive living on an acreage. The cost of gas driving to and from town, I had mentioned that before. And also just the upfront cost of purchasing an acreage can be quite a bit more than living in town. So the fourth challenge is limited infrastructure. So because you're not close to town or right in a town, then you may have struggles with things like different utilities. You might have limited internet connectivity. So you have to possibly get a different provider that is specifically for rural properties. There could be other issues like water supply or even road maintenance. So another challenge for some people is isolation and limited social interaction. So obviously living out of town, living on an acreage where things can often be secluded, you're not going to be seeing people very much. You don't have neighbors that are close by. So if you're not a person that likes to be alone, likes to be sort of just keeping to yourself and your family, then you may not actually enjoy living on an acreage unless you come to town often enough that you're involved in your community and activities like that. The last challenge we're going to talk about is wildlife and pest challenges. So living outside of town in these rural areas, there can obviously be a lot of wildlife that can come onto your property, and also you may have to deal with pest control. So encountering wild animals is possible, and also you may need to put up different safeguards for protecting your property against different pests. So these are the pros and the cons, the advantages and the challenges to acreage living. Make sure that you really consider these things before purchasing your own acreage. I know that most people have on rose-colored glasses when it comes to this type of property, but it's so important to weigh the pros and cons before you make this kind of decision. Thank you guys for tuning into today's video. I hope you found the information valuable. I'll see you next week.